The fluorescent lights above her cast a sterile glow over the ward as Amelia walked briskly, her footsteps muffled against the linoleum floor. It was the end of her night shift, and her mind began to drift to the idea of finally going home and sinking into bed. This was her first month at St. Mary's, and already she had proven herself as a reliable and empathetic doctor, dedicated to each of her patients' needs. As she reviewed her list, one last medication stop caught her eye. She entered the room quietly, aware that one patient was asleep, and moved toward the bedside of the other. "Good morning," she whispered softly as she administered the medication. She heard a raspy sound from the next bed, a dry cough followed by an attempt to speak. Curiosity tugged at her and she turned. The patient in the next bed was old and frail, his once intimidating figure now diminished by the illness that had brought him here. As her gaze fell upon him, a shock of recognition passed through her body like an electric current. She felt the world tilt as the memories flooded back, an angry voice slamming doors, the sting of harsh words. It was Robert Hudson, her father. The man's eyes opened and he looked at her, squinting as if trying to make sense of her face. She quickly looked away, willing herself to stay composed. But she felt a surge of emotions she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Rage, sadness, and something heavier like a stone lodged deep within her chest. "Amelia?" His voice was barely more than a whisper. Amelia froze, gripping the edge of her clipboard tightly. She felt the urge to walk away, to pretend she hadn't heard him. But something held her there, and despite her best judgment she met his gaze. It's been a long time," he continued, his voice thick with regret. She said nothing, her face a controlled mask. The silence hung heavy between them, charged with unspoken words and broken memories. "I never thought, after all these years," he murmured, his tone laced with something she could hardly believe, remorse. The urge to speak, to unleash all the pain, to tell him how deeply he had scarred her, rippled through her, but she held it back. Instead, she forced herself to maintain her professional tone. "Rest, Mr. Hudson," she replied, using his formal name. "You need to focus on your recovery." She turned sharply, her white coat trailing behind her as she exited the room without a backward glance. She could feel his eyes on her, searching, pleading, but she pushed the feeling down, locking it away. Later that night, she sat alone in the on-call room, her mind replaying the encounter with her father. She had spent years trying to bury those memories of his volatile anger, his callousness. She remembered the day she had finally left, sneaking out before dawn with nothing but a small suitcase, vowing never to look back. And she hadn't until now. Ethan, her friend and a fellow doctor, found her there, lost in thought. "Hey Amelia, you alright? You look like you've seen a ghost," he said gently, his tone layered with concern. She forced a smile, but it felt brittle. "I'm fine. Just a long shift." But Ethan saw through her facade. "I know you too well for that," he replied, taking a seat beside her. "You know you can talk to me." Amelia hesitated. She had told no one about her past, not even Ethan. For years she had been the perfect doctor, the healer. Her past was a distant, painful memory, until today. "There's a patient here," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "Someone from my past. Someone I thought I'd left behind." Ethan's face softened as he nodded, allowing her to continue without pressing. "My father," she finally admitted. "I never wanted to see him again, Ethan. He hurt me so much. And now he's here asking for forgiveness." Ethan reached out, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Amelia, forgiveness isn't something you owe him. You get to decide what's right for you. You don't have to face him if you're not ready." Amelia nodded, but she couldn't shake the turmoil inside. Despite everything, a small, almost imperceptible part of her wondered, was she capable of forgiving him? The following week, she continued to avoid her father's room, arranging for other nurses to cover his medication rounds. But one evening, Nurse Sophie approached her. "Amelia, Mr. Hudson has been asking for you," she said, a hint of concern in her voice. "He seems troubled." Amelia's throat tightened. "Thank you, Sophie. I'll see him shortly." That evening she steeled herself, finally deciding to confront him. Entering the room, she found him awake, staring at the ceiling. He turned his head, and when he saw her, a faint smile broke through the lines of his weathered face. "Amelia," he began, his voice trembling. "I know I don't deserve to ask for anything, not after what I did to you." She remained silent, arms crossed, maintaining the distance she had fought to create. "But I've had a lot of time to think," he continued, his gaze heavy with regret. "I hurt you and I know I can never make it right. But I need you to know. I'm sorry. Truly." Amelia felt the words, but they seemed hollow against the weight of years of pain. "Sorry," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. "Do you think that changes anything after everything you put me through?" He lowered his head, his eyes filling with tears. "I don't expect it to. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, Amelia. But you deserve peace, and maybe I thought this could give you that." Amelia's face softened, but only slightly. She wanted to believe that his remorse was genuine, but she also felt the scars that his actions had left on her heart, scars that wouldn't simply vanish with words. "I spent years picking up the pieces of the person you shattered," she said softly, each word laced with years of suppressed anger. "And now you want me to forgive you just because you're asking for it?" Her father closed his eyes, nodding slowly as if he understood. "Please," he whispered, a single tear rolling down his cheek. "I'm begging you, Amelia. Not for me, but for you." She stood in silence, watching the man who had once towered over her, now broken and frail. She felt a surge of conflicting emotions, anger, pity, and something else, a whisper of compassion that she quickly silenced. Without another word, she turned and left the room, her heart a whirlwind of emotions she wasn't ready to face. She had dedicated her life to healing others, yet this was one wound she wasn't sure she could ever mend. As she walked down the hallway, she questioned herself for the first time. Had she done the right thing? Or was she only prolonging her own pain? That night, Amelia tossed and turned in bed, her father's words echoing in her mind. She had spent years building herself up after the years of emotional wreckage he had left behind, yet his plea for forgiveness had stirred something deep within her. Could she truly move on without forgiving him? Or was forgiveness merely a step toward healing herself as he claimed? When she arrived at the hospital the next morning, Amelia was greeted by Sophie, who seemed concerned. "Your father, he had a rough night," Sophie murmured. "His condition is worsening." Amelia felt a pang of something, guilt perhaps, though she quickly pushed it away. She nodded, her mind returning to her father's words, his fragile figure, his broken voice. As much as she wanted to keep him in her past, she couldn't shake the image of him now, vulnerable and remorseful. She felt trapped, torn between who she had become and the wounds he had left behind. Later that evening, Ethan found her staring out of the window in the staff lounge, lost in thought. "You've been distant lately," he said, his voice gentle yet perceptive. "Is it about your father?" Amelia took a deep breath. "He's dying, Ethan. And he keeps asking me to forgive him. Part of me thinks he's only asking because he feels guilty. But part of me wonders if it's something I need to do for myself." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "Forgiveness is a complicated thing, Amelia. It doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean justifying what he did to you. It's about freeing yourself from the power those memories hold over you." She sighed, resting her forehead against her hands. "But every time I see him, it's like those memories come back all over again. I thought I'd moved on, but now it feels like I'm back where I started." Ethan put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're not back where you started. You're here as a brilliant doctor, as someone who's helped countless people. That's all you. Whether you forgive him or not, that's your choice. But don't let this undo everything you've built." Amelia couldn't stop thinking about what Ethan had said. That night, she returned to her father's room. He was asleep, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. For a moment, she allowed herself to study him. The deep lines on his face, the gray hair that had once been so dark, and the frailty of his body. She thought of the man he had once been, harsh and unyielding, and the little girl who had cowered under his anger. Yet standing here now, she no longer felt like that frightened child. He was different, stronger. And perhaps, she thought, that strength was enough to finally put the past to rest. When he awoke, he looked at her in surprise. "Amelia," he began, his voice barely a whisper. She sat down beside him, meeting his gaze directly. "I'm here to talk," she said, her tone calm but firm. "But not for you, for me. I need to understand why you treated me the way you did." Her father's eyes filled with sorrow, and he took a shaky breath. "I don't know if I can give you a good answer," he admitted. "I was angry, Amelia. I was unhappy, and I took it out on you. There's no excuse for it. I was selfish and blinded by my own bitterness. Amelia listened, her expression unreadable. She had waited years for him to say these words, yet now, hearing them, she felt a strange numbness. I can't change the past, he continued, his voice breaking. But I want you to know. I regret it. I regret every single moment that I hurt you. And I know I don't deserve it, but I need you to forgive me. Amelia sat in silence, her mind churning with everything he had said. She could feel the anger simmering beneath her calm exterior, yet she also felt an unexpected sense of closure. Finally, after all these years, she had the answers she'd sought. Maybe I can't forgive you, she said slowly, each word deliberate. But I can let go. I can release the hold this has had on me for so long. And that's enough. Her father's face crumpled as he nodded, accepting her words, though his own eyes reflected the weight of his mistakes. Thank you, Amelia, he whispered. The next morning, Amelia was informed that her father's condition had worsened significantly. He had fallen unconscious in the early hours, his body succumbing to the illness. Despite everything, she felt a pang of sadness. She found herself by his bedside one last time, her hand resting on his. She didn't know if he could hear her, but she spoke softly, her voice filled with a gentleness she hadn't realized she possessed. Goodbye, Dad, she murmured, a finality in her words. I hope you find peace. In the days following his passing, Amelia found herself reflecting on the journey that had led her here. She had not forgiven him, not in the way he might have wanted, but she had released herself from the weight of his past actions. For the first time, she felt a sense of freedom, as if the chains that had bound her for so long had finally been broken. She continued her work with a newfound lightness, knowing that she had faced her past and emerged stronger. And though the scars remained, she no longer carried the burden of that pain. She had reclaimed her story and with it her future. Months passed and Amelia found herself on a quiet morning shift at the hospital. She watched the sunrise through the hospital windows, feeling a strange sense of peace. She thought of her father, of the pain he had caused, and of the strength she had found within herself to move on. Ethan approached her, offering a cup of coffee. You look different, he said, smiling. Lighter. Amelia returned the smile, her eyes bright. I guess I finally learned to let go. He raised his cup in a silent toast, understanding the weight behind her words. To new beginnings, then. She nodded, feeling the truth of those words. He was free at last.